What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
It's tradition to leave you out, don't be so sensitive. That was what Caitlin said to me, over mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce, her voice light and laughing. Like she had just offered a charming anecdote from childhood, and not a cold slap to the face in front of 12 other family members who chuckled right along with her like this was some long-running sitcom gag. My brother Mark let out one of those half-laughs, the kind where you can tell he doesn't really want to get involved, but also doesn't have the spine to push back. My mother sipped her wine like she didn't hear a thing, her lips pinched in that expression of hers that somehow always said, "Don't cause trouble, Lena," without her even needing to open her mouth. And Grandma Jean, God bless her ice-veined heart, just smirked and gave Caitlin a little wink, like she'd just earned herself another gold star in the perfect daughter competition she's been winning unopposed since high school. I didn't respond. I just smiled, nodded, and chewed my green beans while my inner voice whispered the same sentence over and over. Remember this moment. Make it count. Because the thing no one in that room ever seemed to notice, despite having known me for over 40 years, is that I never, ever forget a damn thing. That Thanksgiving dinner wasn't unique, not really. It was just the final straw stacked on a teetering pile of passive-aggressive tradition and exclusion that had been building for decades, brick by smug little brick. When I was a kid, they forgot to tell me about the family beach trip until the night before they left, then acted surprised when I cried. In middle school, I got perfect grades, but they only framed Caitlin's report cards because she tries so hard, even with her learning style being different. At my high school graduation, they brought a poster-sized photo of Mark in his football uniform to wave during the ceremony, as if I were the opening act and he was the main event, even though I was the one giving the valedictorian speech. And when Dad died, and I was the one who sat with him in the hospital every day for 3 weeks, feeding him ice chips and writing down his thoughts when he couldn't speak, it was Caitlin they called brave at the funeral for flying in on such short notice. So no, I wasn't surprised when Caitlin tossed out her little jab like a warm dinner roll, expecting everyone to eat it up and move on. What did surprise me, what actually burned into my chest like a hot coal, was how easy it still was for them. How quick they all were to laugh, to join in, to treat my quiet pain like it was part of the furniture. They didn't just expect me to take it. They expected me to thank them for including me at all. And I had. For most of my life, I had. But not anymore. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of needing more gravy, though I couldn't have eaten another bite if you paid me. I leaned on the countertop, breathing slow, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was colder than that. It was a kind of clarity that only comes after years of swallowing your voice to keep the peace. I realized in that moment that I didn't want peace anymore. I wanted presence. Not their approval, not their fake apologies or forced hugs. Just the undeniable fact that I existed, and not just as a punchline. I brought the gravy back to the table, smiled through dessert, listened to Caitlin brag about her yoga teaching side hustle, and how little Henry is already reading at a third-grade level. When Grandma opened her second bottle of wine and started asking who was bringing what to the annual Christmas brunch, no one asked me. Of course they didn't. It's tradition. I sat back and looked at each of their faces, every one of them older, more wrinkled than the year before, but still stuck in the same dance. I realized they weren't going to change. Not because they didn't care, but because they were so convinced they were the good guys. In their minds, I was the overly sensitive one, the one who never laughed at herself, the one who couldn't take a joke. In their eyes, Caitlin wasn't cruel, she was charming. And that, I think, is what hurt the most. Not the joke, but the fact that they meant it. And maybe that's what finally did it. Maybe that was the moment something in me cracked, but in a clean way, like ice breaking on a frozen lake, not shattered, but finally letting the water underneath rise to the surface. I nodded to myself, slowly, and I swear to you it felt like an answer. That night, when I got home, I poured myself a glass of red wine, opened my laptop, and pulled up the photo file I hadn't shown a single soul yet. Not my friends, not my coworkers, and certainly not my family. It was from 3 weeks earlier when I stood on stage in a black dress I'd borrowed from a friend because I still don't own anything expensive and accepted a Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. I'd written an essay under a pseudonym, a brutal, honest piece about emotional invisibility and generational gaslighting in families. It had been picked up by The Atlantic, then shared over 1,000,000 times. No one had known it was me. And that photo, me standing next to the editor-in-chief, holding the award, that moment I'd waited my entire life for, was staring back at me, untouched, unseen, and powerful as hell. So I did what Caitlin never expected from the family footnote. I opened a custom printing website, uploaded the image, and ordered a 24 by 36-inch canvas wrap, museum quality, no expense spared. I addressed it to Grandma's house, marked it as a gift, and scheduled it to arrive exactly one day before the annual family barbecue. The same event I was always forgotten for. The same tradition that left me out every single year. I didn't add a card. I didn't need to. You ever been the forgotten one? The extra chair no one sets? The sibling they use as contrast to make the other shine brighter? Tell me in the comments, how long would you keep taking the joke before you became the punchline that punches back? I poured myself another glass of wine, sat back, and waited for the group text to explode. I think the hardest part of being invisible isn't the silence, it's the noise you still hear from the sidelines. You hear their laughter, their memories, their inside jokes that you're somehow always too late to catch or too distant to be part of, and no matter how old you get or how many years pass between holidays or birthdays or lifeless phone calls filled with polite awkwardness, the echo of that laughter sticks like a stain you can't scrub out of the walls of your memory. And for a long time, I told myself that maybe I was imagining it all, that maybe I was just too quiet or too bookish or too independent, that maybe I didn't want to be included as much as I said I did, but the truth is, I did desperately, and pretending otherwise only made it worse. When I left for college, it wasn't a big send-off. No car full of banners, no family dinner the night before, no weepy photo album from my mom, or a handwritten letter from Grandma. Caitlin had gotten all of that, plus a check big enough to cover her first semester's textbooks and an iPad with her name engraved on the back. I got a quick hug from the front door and a call us when you get there. I loaded up my used car with a box of secondhand kitchenware and a coffee maker that leaked if you didn't wedge a spoon under the carafe just right, and I drove 4 hours to a dorm room that smelled like cleaning chemicals and ambition. And that's where it started. Not the writing that had been in me since I was old enough to notice things others missed, but the fire. The slow, silent fire that burns only when someone has spent their entire life being told they're not enough without ever using those exact words. I didn't write about my family at first. I wrote about places. I wrote about strangers. I wrote about women I watched from coffee shops and men on the subway and couples arguing in hushed tones in grocery store aisles. I wrote to understand the world because understanding my own life felt impossible. And I was good. Not brilliant, not yet, but good enough that professors took notice, good enough that one of them pulled me aside after class one day and said, "Whatever you do, don't stop. You've got something that can't be taught." I carried that compliment like a secret weapon, one I pulled out on nights when I failed to make rent or when I got ghosted by a guy who thought I was too quiet or too serious. And there were a lot of those nights. The first essay I ever submitted to a real magazine got rejected in under 24 hours. I stared at the email for a long time, rereading the generic wording as if maybe, hidden between the lines, there was something personal meant just for me. There wasn't. I submitted another piece the next week. And another after that. For 10 years, I wrote into a void that barely blinked back. I collected rejection emails like postcards, printed them out and tacked them to the back of my closet door like some twisted vision board. And each time someone in my family asked how work was going, I smiled and said, busy, even when I was eating instant noodles and wondering if maybe I should have studied something more practical. Caitlin, of course, never asked what I was writing. She always found a way to pivot the conversation toward her next side project or how exhausted she was from organizing the PDA talent show or why the school board just didn't appreciate the unpaid labor of stay-at-home moms. My mother liked to ask if I had found a man yet, as if that was the real missing piece in the puzzle of my life. And Grandma Jean? She'd occasionally mail me clippings from the local paper, stories written by people I went to high school with a sticky note that said, "Look how well Katie's doing," or "Thought this might inspire you." It was never malicious, not overtly, but every gesture was a reminder that I hadn't arrived yet, that I was still the family shadow trailing behind the golden children. Then came the essay. It was written in a single night, poured out of me like blood from a reopened wound, and it wasn't about strangers or faraway places or imagined lives. It was about them. About me. About what it means to be the leftover sibling, the one no one roots for, the one who becomes convenient only when someone else needs contrast. It was raw and furious and deeply personal, and I sent it off the next morning under a pen name I'd never used before, just initials, gender neutral, clean. I told myself it wouldn't go anywhere. I told myself it was just therapy. But 3 weeks later, I got the email. The Atlantic wanted to publish it. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before I let myself believe it was real. It went viral within a week. People shared it with captions like, "This is me, and I thought I was alone, and read this if you've ever felt forgotten." My inbox filled with messages from strangers telling me how it broke them, how it healed them, how it helped them finally understand their own story. For the first time in my life, my silence had become a voice loud enough to reach people I'd never met. And I said nothing to my family. Not even a whisper. 6 months later, when the Pulitzer nominations were announced, I didn't breathe for an entire afternoon. When I got the call confirming I'd won, I sat on the floor of my apartment and cried into my cat's fur like a child. I hadn't told anyone about the nomination. No one at all. Not even my closest friends. It was too big, too sacred, too personal. I'd carried that win like a secret weapon, not because I wanted to gloat or prove something, not exactly, but because I finally had something that was mine. Not shared, not diminished, not mocked with a joke at the dinner table. Mine. But the truth was, it wasn't enough just to win. Not anymore. What I wanted, more than anything, was for them to see it and to feel the weight of everything they'd chosen to ignore. Not just once. Not just on one bad Thanksgiving. But over a lifetime of being treated like a placeholder. I didn't want their applause. I wanted the silence between us to finally speak for itself. And so I planned. Quietly. Carefully. With precision that only someone used to watching from the margins could pull off. Because the long game isn't about rushing in with a speech and demanding your moment. It's about waiting until the room is quiet, until everyone thinks they know how the story ends, and then rewriting it in a voice they can't ignore. There's something almost absurd about receiving the biggest recognition of your life in a room full of strangers, each one smiling and clapping and lifting champagne flutes in your direction, while the people who were supposed to shape you, supposed to raise you, love you, guide you, remain completely unaware, living their lives in blissful ignorance, maybe laughing over a group chat meme, maybe swapping zucchini bread recipes or passive-aggressive gossip about which cousin's marriage is starting. To look shaky. That was what I kept thinking as I stood there on stage, the heavy weight of the Pulitzer medal pressing against my collarbone like a silent dare, proof of everything I had been told, through implication or omission, that I wasn't capable of achieving. I didn't cry during the ceremony, not even once, though I could feel the tears threatening the corners of my eyes more than once as I watched other winners embrace their parents, spouses, adult children, or lifelong mentors who sat in the front row, dabbing at their eyes and mouthing, "I'm so proud of you," from across the room. There was a woman, an environmental journalist from Vermont, who gave a beautiful, eloquent speech and then stepped down from the podium straight into her father's arms. He looked like the kind of man who fixed broken things for a living, weathered hands and a soft flannel shirt, and I envied her with a bitterness so sharp I could barely swallow it down. She got a man who stood up when she walked into the room. I got a family that forgot my birthday 3 years in a row and called it being busy. And yet, there I was, the same Lena who was left out of the family calendar every single year, who had to email reminders just to be invited to her nephew's baptism. Now standing in a silk dress that I'd rented the night before with a pair of shoes I bought at a secondhand shop and couldn't feel my toes in, posing for photographs that would circulate in journals and press releases and emails I knew my family would never open, because they didn't read what I wrote and they never had. When the last round of applause died down and the lights dimmed for the cocktail hour, I didn't linger. I said a few polite thank yous, shook hands with two editors who wanted to talk about book deals, accepted a small box containing the physical medal, and slipped out the side exit like I was late for a bus. I didn't want to celebrate with strangers. I didn't want to smile into more lenses. I just wanted to get somewhere quiet before the weight of it all cracked me in half. Outside, the city felt uncharacteristically quiet for a spring evening in Manhattan. I walked to the end of the block, heels clicking on the pavement like a metronome, and ducked into a little wine bar that had one empty table in the back and soft jazz humming through a speaker above the bar. The waitress didn't recognize me, and that felt like mercy. I ordered a glass of the most expensive red on the menu, not because I was trying to be fancy, but because I needed the taste of something strong and complicated, something that made me feel older than I was, like I had earned the right to sit in the dark alone without explanation. I pulled the medal out of the box and laid it on the table in front of me, just to look at it, just to convince myself that it was real and not something my brain had conjured out of years of resentment and bruised ambition. I stared at it for what felt like hours, running my finger along the edge of it, feeling the etched letters like Braille, like some forgotten language I was only just beginning to understand. And in that dim little room, with the sound of clinking glass and a couple laughing in a booth across the floor, I made the decision that changed everything, not the kind of loud, movie scene decision where someone stands up and proclaims vengeance or destiny, but the quiet kind, the kind that settles in your stomach like warm concrete. I decided I wasn't going to tell them, not in a text, not in a phone call, not even in a passive tweet that could be traced back to me with a little effort. I was going to let them stay in the dark, stay convinced that nothing important had ever come out of me, that I was still the odd one out, the satellite orbiting the more interesting lives of Caitlin and Mark and Grandma's favorite photo albums. Because there's a certain kind of power in being underestimated for so long that people forget to even check for your shadow. But silence, as satisfying as it was in that moment, didn't feel complete. It wasn't enough to keep the medal to myself, to lock it away in a drawer or frame it in my office like a private joke. No, what I needed, truly and deeply, was a moment, something tangible and unavoidable, something that would stop them in their tracks and force them to confront the gap between who they believed I was and who I had actually become. And I didn't want that confrontation to come from my mouth. I didn't want the moment to be tainted by explanations or awkward pauses or backpedaling apologies. I wanted it to come from something they couldn't argue with, couldn't laugh away, couldn't brush off as another one of Lena's moods. So I did what any overlooked, underestimated little sister would do in the age of online printing and 2-day shipping. I took the best photo from the ceremony, a shot where I'm smiling without overthinking it, the medal visible, the banner in the background reading Pulitzer Prize winner, just large enough to be unmistakable. And I uploaded it to a canvas printing service I'd used once before when Caitlin had asked me to design a family photo collage for Grandma's 80th birthday. I knew the dimensions Grandma preferred. I knew her wall space. I knew how she liked gold frames, but hated anything that looked modern. I knew exactly how to make it blend in with the other portraits, while still standing out enough to stop the conversation cold. I wrote no message. I included no card. I selected the gift option, wrapped it in the same floral packaging Caitlin had used the year she sent Grandma an oil painting of Henry's handprint turkey, and scheduled it to arrive 2 days before the annual family barbecue. Just in time for the pre-party setup, just early enough to guarantee Grandma herself would be the one to open it and hang it on the wall. And then I waited. Not for revenge. Not even for recognition. But for the silence to break in a way it never had before. There's a unique kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you've set something in motion that no one else sees coming, not out of malice or spite, though those emotions certainly flicker at the edges of it, but from a deeper place. A place carved out by years of being spoken over, laughed at, minimized, or worse, entirely forgotten, and when that kind of quiet vengeance begins to unfold, not with fire and fury, but with the delicate precision of a chess move 10 turns in the making, there is a stillness that settles inside you, a calm so absolute it feels like standing in the eye of your own private storm, untouched while everything around you begins to tilt and sway under the weight of a truth it was never prepared to handle. I knew what I was doing the moment I hit confirm order, and as the tracking updates began to roll in, processed, shipped, out for delivery, I felt no guilt, no anxiety, no hesitation, only the slow, rising certainty that the years of being a footnote in my own family's story had finally met their expiration date. I didn't want their apologies, not really, and I didn't crave their praise, because what does applause mean when it comes from people who never even clapped for your first steps? What I wanted was simple, almost childishly so. I wanted them to know, undeniably, irrevocably, and without escape, that I had done something extraordinary, that I had reached a summit they never even bothered to ask if I was climbing, and that I had done it not in spite of their silence, but because of it. On the morning of the delivery, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I expected to see it arrive. My apartment was several hours away from Grandma's house, and I wouldn't be anywhere near the barbecue. But because I could feel the weight of the day pressing against my skin like weather, and I wanted to feel it fully, to sit with it, to savor it. I made myself a slow breakfast, something I rarely did: scrambled eggs with thyme, thick slices of toast, fresh coffee, a touch of marmalade, the kind of breakfast you make when you want the hours to pass softly. I played Miles Davis on the old record player I'd picked up at a flea market 4 years ago, and I opened my laptop not to work, but just to watch the family group chat sit dormant, quiet, unassuming, a powder keg with a lit fuse no one could see yet. I kept my phone on the kitchen counter, turned face down so I wouldn't obsessively refresh it, and instead wandered around my small apartment, picking up objects, straightening books, folding a blanket I hadn't used in weeks. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was moving through space with total agency, like the world was tilting toward me instead of away from me. When I finally turned my phone over around 3 in the afternoon, the first message had landed. It was from Caitlin, of course, always the first to react to anything that threatens the gravitational center she believes is her by birthright, and it said, simply, "Is this a joke?" I read it 3 times, then locked the phone again. I didn't reply. I knew better than to start unraveling the thread too soon. Within minutes, Mark chimed in, more cautious, less venomous, the way he always tried to split the difference between involvement and detachment. "Wait, is that real? Is that you, Lena?" The group chat began to light up, names blinking into the thread like popcorn popping in a pan, and though none of them knew for certain I was watching, every word felt like it was being typed in all caps. Grandma, who rarely used the group chat except for holiday reminders and the occasional blurry photo of her garden, finally added her voice, and what she wrote stopped me cold, not because it was cruel, but because it was something I had never heard her say to me directly in all my years on this earth. "Why didn't you tell us?" Not "congratulations." Not "we're proud." Not even "is this true?" Just a single, pointed question that somehow managed to accuse and absolve at the same time, like her generation always knew how to do, guilt masked as curiosity, love doled out in teaspoons only when convenient. I didn't respond to that either, though I read it at least a dozen times, watching the words rearrange themselves in my mind, morphing into all the variations I wished she had sent instead. But that's the thing about silence. Once you realize how much power it holds, it becomes almost addictive, a shield that protects and punishes in equal measure. As the messages kept coming, some stunned, some defensive, some clearly written in tones that begged for denial, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped out onto my tiny balcony, the city buzzing beneath me like it didn't even know my name. And I thought about the photograph they were all now staring at, the moment that had been captured and framed and delivered without warning. I imagined Grandma opening the package, lifting the floral paper with her thin, careful hands, expecting another craft project from Caitlin or maybe a framed family photo from last Christmas, only to be met with that image, me in a black dress, a medal draped over my chest, smiling not with smugness or triumph, but with something quieter, something closer to peace. I imagined the silence in her living room, the way Caitlin probably snatched the box away to read the shipping label, the way Mark likely hovered in the background trying to decide if this was one of those moments where siding with me would cause too much trouble. I imagined my mother standing there, arms crossed, lips pursed, running through every version of "why didn't she tell us" that blamed me for their blindness. And I felt nothing. Not sadness, not guilt, not even satisfaction. Just release. That night, as the barbecue played out without me, burgers flipped, drinks poured, obligatory group selfies taken, I sat alone in my apartment, rereading every message, still refusing to reply, still choosing absence over explanation. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the forgotten one. I felt like the one they could no longer afford to ignore. What none of them realized, and what I didn't fully understand until that moment, was that the portrait wasn't just a declaration. It was a mirror. And I had sent it to show them what they missed while they were too busy laughing, too busy praising each other, too busy pretending that silence was the same thing as peace. Let them sit with it. Let them scroll and wonder and rewrite the stories they've told about me for decades. Because the only voice I had ever truly needed to raise was the one that had already spoken, and I didn't need a group text to prove it had finally been heard. It began not with an explosion, not with fire and rage and the kind of dramatic breakdown you might expect when decades of buried resentment and unspoken truths finally crawl to the surface, but with something much quieter, much more unsettling. A delayed silence that stretched out far too long, followed by a flurry of polite confusion masquerading as concern, the way only families can pretend that chaos is a question and not the long-overdue answer to a problem they've refused to acknowledge. For years. The group chat, usually reserved for birthday emojis, crock-pot recipes, and passive-aggressive holiday planning, had become a strange sort of battlefield, though no one would call it that, at least not out loud. Because that would require admitting that the war had been going on all along, and that maybe, just maybe, I'd been the only one bleeding in silence while everyone else danced around me, too busy with their own reflections to notice who they were stepping on. The first signs of real discomfort came not from Caitlin, who predictably doubled down within hours of the portrait's arrival, lacing her messages with the kind of faux humor that barely conceals the panic beneath, but from the peripheral members of the family, the cousins and in-laws and vaguely connected branches who didn't quite know what to make of the sudden revelation that the person they'd spent decades mildly pitying or ignoring had quietly, undeniably, accomplished something most people only ever dream of. One of my aunt's dad's sister, the one who always sent Christmas cards 2 weeks late and signed them with just her first name, messaged me privately that evening, a screenshot of the article attached, with nothing but the word "wow." It wasn't praise. It wasn't judgment. It was just the stunned acknowledgement of someone realizing they had missed something big, and they had missed it not by accident, but by habit. Caitlin, of course, had no intention of letting the narrative slip from her fingers without a fight. She posted 3 long messages in a row, carefully typed, overly polished, each one brimming with performative warmth and barely concealed barbs, all of it dripping with the tone of someone who was trying to appear gracious while actually demanding control. "We're all just so surprised," she wrote, followed quickly by, "You should have told us. You didn't have to keep it a secret," and then, the one that truly cemented the absurdity of it all. "It feels a little hurtful that you'd write something so personal and not share it with your own family." I read those words again and again, letting them settle into the hollowness I thought might erupt in fury, but instead all I felt was a kind of tired amusement, the sort of bone-deep weariness that comes when someone who's never truly seen you tries to play the victim in your story, as though the years of invisibility were a misunderstanding and not a choice. For a long time, I said nothing. The chat continued without me, speculation turning into damage control, and damage control turning into that quiet, almost desperate dance of trying to reinstate the normal rhythm of conversation. Mark attempted to be the peacemaker, as always, sending a message that read, "This is a big deal. Obviously, let's just be proud of Lena and not make it weird, which, in typical fashion, accomplished absolutely nothing except confirming his long-standing talent for saying something that felt like everything and nothing all at once. Eventually, though, I responded not with a monologue, not with the full reckoning they might have expected, not even with a bitter joke that would have allowed them to write it off as just another of my so-called moods, but with a single line, typed slowly, deliberately, and without apology. I didn't think tradition included being proud of me. That was all. No punctuation, no sign-off. Just the sentence. I sent it, closed the chat, and deleted the notification badge from my phone like it was a piece of lint on my sweater. I didn't care what they said afterward. I didn't care if they called each other or huddled in their smaller chats to dissect what I meant or how offended they should be. I didn't want to be part of that conversation anymore. I had given them exactly what they gave me for most of my life. Silence followed by the kind of truth that makes people squirm because they can't argue with it without indicting themselves. For days, no one reached out. Not Caitlin, not Mark, not even Grandma, though I heard through a mutual cousin that the portrait was still hanging on her wall, positioned exactly where all the old family photos used to be, displacing a picture of Caitlin's wedding reception that had once been treated like a shrine. That small detail satisfied me more than I care to admit, not because I wanted to hurt Caitlin, but because something I created, something of me, now occupied a place that could no longer be ignored, tucked into their domestic mythology whether they liked it or not. A week later, an envelope arrived at my apartment, no return address, just a simple cream card with a gold border, and inside, in Grandma's neat, almost rigid handwriting, a single quote was written: "Sometimes it takes silence to be heard." There was no signature, no note, no apology. Just the quote, as if she couldn't bring herself to say the words, but still needed to say something, anything, to avoid being entirely erased from the new chapter that had already begun to write itself. I pinned the card to the wall beside the Pulitzer certificate, not out of sentiment, but because it felt like a punctuation mark, one that was both an ending and a beginning, depending on how you chose to read it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Months passed, and the group chat returned to its default rhythm: holiday logistics, mildly offensive memes, baby photos from second cousins I hadn't seen in 15 years, but I never rejoined. I watched it now and then, like a window display in a store I no longer shopped at, familiar but no longer necessary. And when they mentioned me, if they mentioned me, they did so carefully, like someone referencing a ghost who might overhear if you spoke too loudly. The truth is, I didn't need their congratulations. I didn't need their approval. What I had needed all along was to know that I was real, not just in my own mind, not just in my own apartment, but real in the eyes of those who once refused to see me unless it benefited their story. And now they did. Maybe not in the way they wanted. Maybe not in the way they could make peace with. But they saw me. And for once, they had no choice but to sit with what they saw. I don't know if that makes me cruel. I don't know if it makes me petty or brave or tragic or something else entirely. I only know that I stopped waiting. I stopped apologizing. And in that silence, I found something louder than any of their voices ever were: the sound of my own name, spoken clearly, without compromise, without permission, and finally, heard.